My mother has a knack for knowing exactly what it is that I need in my life. Now, it might be that she is indeed a wise woman on her own. And it could be that she just has some special insight simply by being my mother. And it could be that she is presenting some revelation from God through her own quiet prayer life. And of course, it was probably some mix of all three of those things. Over my life, she has offered me some wise suggestions that I mostly listen to, which I probably would not have realized that it was what I needed, or I would not have enjoyed it without her insight. For one example, I would never have taken organ lessons on my own if it weren't for my mother's suggestion to do so when I was in college. I just didn't think I really needed to do that at the time. But she thought I might like it, and sure enough, she was right. And that is one of the reasons why I'm here with you today. There was also that time when, after I had broken up with a longtime girlfriend, she came to me to say that, well, she really hadn't thought the two of us were right for each other anyway. And she was right, but I do kind of wish she would have spoken up earlier on that one. And of course, there was the years-old struggle we had over eating my vegetables and expanding my tastes. For over a decade of my life, the focus of the struggle was green beans. I simply refused to eat them. There was a past memory where they hadn't stayed down that influenced my decision. But Mom assured me that they were both good on their own and good for me. But I wouldn't believe her. Even if they were freshly picked from Great Uncle Evan's garden, even when she cooked them with ham and bacon, I just wouldn't do it. In fact, Mom and Grandma even fibbed once, trying to convince me that they were good. Grandma spent most of a meal trying to tell me that the ricotta cheese in the lasagna was actually bleached green beans. She'd starched the color out herself just that afternoon. And that was probably the closest they ever got to convincing me that green beans were good. Because how could Grandma be lying about that? Now, eventually, though, I did get to eating my green beans. That's a different story, but sure enough, they were very good, and they were good for me. And we're even growing some in our garden this summer. So it turns out, once again, Mom knew what it was that I needed, even when I did not know myself. In her wisdom, my mother understood that the things I wanted weren't necessarily the things that I needed. She understood that her children's desires were not always directed at the things that were needed, that were best. And so she did her best to suggest and persuade us toward those things that were actually what were needed in our lives. And though we all may have grown up some, no doubt we still have struggles with wanting and desiring things that are bad for us more than the things that we know are good for us. Or perhaps we still convince ourselves that what we want is actually what we need. Or we are convinced that no one could possibly understand us better than ourselves, and so no one could ever tell us what we need other than ourselves. I think this is true in our day-to-day, mundane physical life, but even more so in our spiritual lives. Our hearts and minds are tricky things. Even the wisest have trouble discerning what desires should be encouraged and which desires should be dismissed. We may think we need to relieve our stress through some retail therapy, perhaps, when what we really needed was some solitude to reflect on what was bothering us and stressing us. We may think that what we need to hear is a song that just perfectly fits our mood to encourage it, when what we really need was silence, that we might hear a quieter voice within us. Or we might convince ourselves that what we really need is the solution and correction to all of our earthly problems, those that are here and now. when what we actually need is the faith and courage to endure these hardships and witness to the salvation that is yet to come. And it is this last difference, I think, that we can see on display in our gospel reading today. Now, today is our first of 5 weeks that we're going to spend in the 6th chapter of John's gospel. And the whole chapter, I think, could be read as an extended misunderstanding about what we think we need and what we actually need. So, as last week in Mark, we again find Jesus and his disciples crossing the Sea of Galilee and a large crowd following them around to the other side. And once on the other side, Jesus sits down with the disciples, and this is a common phrasing to hint that he was teaching them. You sit to teach. That's what you did at that time. And as in Mark, we see Jesus then having concern for this crowd that has followed him. He wants to find food for all of those who have come such a long way to receive healing and to hear him teaching. But then he asks his disciples, where are we going to find food for all these people? And they are incredulous at this idea. It doesn't make any sense. Even if there was enough food in a market nearby, which of course there wasn't, it was out in the middle of nowhere. They didn't have enough money to buy all that food. 6 months' wages, Philip says, is not enough. The crowd is about 5,000 people, John says. And I think we can cut the disciples a bit of slack here, because Jesus is indeed asking them to accomplish a miraculous task, even without his miracle. But of course, John notes that Jesus knows what he's going to do, and he takes a little boy's 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, he gives thanks for them, and distributes them to the crowd. And miraculously, everyone is able to have their fill. And there are 12 baskets left over, which is a biblically significant number. What exactly it signifies here, well, we can speculate about that next time we read this gospel, so look for that in 3 years. You got 3 years to ruminate on it and think about it. But in response to this sign of feeding, of miraculous bread and fish, see what it is that the crowds do. Now, of course, they were amazed at this miraculous feeding in the wilderness, and with the Jewish Passover feast so near, no doubt, they have in mind God's mighty acts of the past. Those acts that included, God feeding the Israelites through the wilderness with the manna from heaven. And it's easy enough then to put 2 and 2 together. And the crowd declares that Jesus is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world. A prophetic promise declared through Moses that God would raise up from among the Israelites another prophet that would be just like Moses, who would speak the words of God to the people, and that the people would be required to listen to him. And so, being that prophet, the crowd decides that they need Jesus to be their king. He has miraculously provided bread for them. He is clearly this prophet Moses proclaimed, so of course he must be made the king of Israel, whether he wants to or not. But Jesus isn't having any of this. The text says that they tried by force to make him king, but he withdrew to the mountain by himself. Jesus resists being made into their political leader. He resists the crowd's desire to have him fulfill all of their temporal desires. Now, this will become more and more apparent in the coming weeks, but the crowds think that they know what they need. They think that what they need is a political ruler to bring them political salvation from Rome. What they think they need is physical nourishment and this miracle worker to continuously give them this physical bread. What they think they need is to have their desires met in ways that make perfect sense to them. But Jesus knows better. Jesus knows that their real need is not for salvation from Rome, but rather salvation from sin. Jesus knows that their real need is not for the physical nourishment of barley loaves, but for the spiritual nourishment of the bread of life. Jesus knows that their needs are not to be met by the simple, understandable things of the world, but ultimately by God, who is so far beyond their imagination. We turn then to Jesus to find out what it is we really need. We turn to Jesus to give us the wisdom to understand what is needful for our spiritual health and what's just simply an untamed desire. And we turn to Jesus for his grace and for his mercy, that, as our collect said this morning, he might lead us through the things temporal so that we might not lose the things eternal, and that ultimately we would be brought before the throne of God, that our deepest needs, the deepest needs of our hearts might be fulfilled, and that we would find the rest of God from his presence and life. Amen.